guess it's actually going. A little bit about me. I didn't really do much of an intro last time. So I'm originally from the Corpus Christi, Texas area. I was actually born in St. Croix in the U.S.
You know about Selena then?
I know all about Selena. I've been to the Selena Memorial many a times when I go down to Corpus.
That's on my bucket list.
I would love to go to
I'm
Selena
from
Memorial.
Mexico. I'm from that area. I just never been.
Yeah,
So it's on my bucket list.
no, it's something else. And like I actually very distinctly remember where I was when Selena was murdered and everything. It was like one of these things. If you guys don't know, you guys know Selena? Yeah, you know the movie and everything? Yeah. So, yeah, so Selena's from Corpus. Yeah. Or not from Corpus, but that's where she was. Yeah, made her. That's where she died. That's where she was famous and everything. Yeah. So originally from Corpus Christi, Texas area. I've been in Hattiesburg. This is my 9th year here. I started off. My first teaching job was in Ohio, and then I was in Georgia for a while because my wife was doing her PhD at University of Georgia, and I was teaching at a small liberal arts college. Then we came over here in 2007. She has actually recruited for a job here. She's the director of the Speaking Center, and she's an associate professor of communication studies. And they had to take me as part of the deal, so I came along with her, and they had a job for me in the political science department. I was teaching there for a while, then economics was actually over in the College of Business. But when it came over, then I switched my line from political science, international development to economics, because I'm actually an economist. I went to the University of Texas. So no Aggies in here, I presume? No? Good. That's good. All right. Let's go ahead and get started. Any questions over the readings at this point? So the idea always is that try to go over the readings, at least read in a very cursory manner the chapter before you get to class. If you don't have time to read it in detail, that's fine. Just kind of know the highlights, know the headings, that sort of thing. Then once you've come to the lecture or watch the lecture online, go back and reread the chapter. It's always a good idea to kind of get a couple passes at the material. So today what we're talking about is chapter 1. Now chapter 1 is a little bit tricky because there's a whole lot in it. They don't do much with it in terms of there's like not a lot of depth, but there's a lot of tools that you're going to be seeing throughout the rest of the semester. And essentially what we're going to do today is we're going to cover 3 main topics. The first is we're just going to ask the question, what is economics? Try to understand a little bit about the field of economics, where it comes from, as well as what sort of topics and subjects we're going to be studying. The second thing that we're going to do is we're going to study the first of the 2 models that are going to be seen in this chapter and kind of the beginning of the class. The first one is known as the production possibilities model. And this last thing that we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the second model, which is supply and demand. Now, we're going to spend a lot of time on supply and demand throughout the next few weeks. We're going to see it in a couple different contexts. We're going to get into more detail even in chapter 2 than what we're going to see in chapter 1, but right now we're just going to do the basic introduction to supply and demand. Now, to get to supply and demand, though, we have to ask this first question about what is economics. So, I'm sorry, forgot your name already.
Amber?
Amber. What is your definition of economics?
Basically how goods are distributed and put together and sent over the world, and capitalism and the whole money thing with it along.
All right, so the whole money thing with it.
It is kind of like definition.
It's all together. But the first part is really the critical nature of it is, how goods are distributed, right? So that's what we're going to focus a lot on. Yeah, Garrett, is that right? Okay, Garrett.
Also how resources are used and how resources are turned into goods and how people play a part in the economic system.
Right, so we produce these goods, and the question is how are they distributed, but also how are the resources that we have to produce goods allocated such that we're able to produce the goods, and how do those goods then get about to people. So it's all that distribution of both the resources and the goods that we produce with the resources. So the way that I think about it is that we can think about it in terms of, it's the science that studies how scarce resources are used to satisfy unlimited wants. So in this definition, we have a couple important words here that are just descriptive, just adjectives here. First one is that we're talking about scarce resources, right? And the other thing is that we have unlimited wants. So the whole problem that's associated with economics is that you can't get everything that you want, right? That there is no free lunch, that you're going to have to give up something in order to get something else. That there are lots of different things that we could do with this, and how do we satisfy those unlimited wants is how are we going to distribute these goods that we're producing. And specifically, we have to make these tough choices because these resources are scarce. We can't make everyone happy all the time. There's going to have to be some people that get less of the good, and we're not going to be able to use the resources to produce the goods that they want, while other people are going to get more of the good, and they're going to be able to satisfy their wants more easily. And the question is, how does society go about allocating these resources? Now, when we talk about resources, what are the two things that people always say they don't have enough of? Money, right? You never have enough money, you never have enough time, right? Now, that's the easiest way to think about this allocation problem. That you think about, okay, I've got to spend, a certain amount of time every day studying. I want to spend a certain amount of time hanging out with my friends. I want to spend a certain amount of my time watching Netflix. I have to, I'd like to go eat at some point as well. Maybe to, take a nap, go sleep. All these sorts of things you want to do, and you just never have enough time for all of it. If you had more time, then maybe you could get a part-time job and earn some more money so you could go do some other things, right? So time and money is often, like, in our consumer mind, these are the things that we have that are scarce resources. Now, from an economy-wide perspective, though, there's more stuff. And specifically, we think of economic resources. I'm going to erase this so it's a little easier to read. It's not the best whiteboard ever, or eraser. Let's see. Just kind of smudging things right now. Any better? Yeah. When we think about economic resources, we think about three different economic resources. We think about land, labor, and capital. Now, take a couple minutes to define these because what you think of as land and what you think of as capital may not be the same economic definition of land, labor, and capital. Labor is pretty straightforward, but it's important to talk about all this stuff. So what is land? What is land?
Natural resources.
So it's the natural resources, right? So anything that is kind of produced by the, that's just given by the earth, we think of as land. So that could be the land itself, physically, right? So like the physical space. It could be the minerals, the oil, the resources that are underneath. It could be the water flowing through it or the rivers and lakes and all that sort of stuff. Any of these natural resources, that's what we think of as land. And this is an economic resource because we can use it to produce other goods. We can use that land to produce wheat. We can use that land to grow forests and produce trees and chop those down to produce, plywood, whatever else we want. Labor, what's that?
The workers?
The workers, right? So it's human time and effort. So this is the resource, the economic resource that you're most closely in control of, right? Your own time and effort. You're a supplier of this resource because you can supply your time to do things, work at a job, study, whatever it is. You're deciding how to use your labor. Capital is the trickiest one in terms of definition. And in fact, the textbook doesn't refer to it as capital. They just say machinery, right? Which is the easier way to think about it. Capital is kind of a broader category where it's basically any good that can be used to produce a good or service, right? So you have some sort of good that's in existence. Just want to make sure that's not shutting off. Okay. You have some good that's in existence. Let's say it's a classroom, it's a projector, it's a computer, something like that. And we're using those goods to produce something else. Specifically, like right now, we're supposed to be producing educational resources, right? We're supposed to be producing educational services. And so capital, we think of as the goods that help produce other goods and services. And that could be a truck, right? If the truck is owned by USM, or that same Ford F-150, if it's owned by USM, then it can be capital, but if it's owned by me and I just take myself back and forth to work in it, it's no longer capital. So it depends on who owns it and what they're using it for, right? If it's a consumption good, it's one thing. If it's owned by a company that helps produce a good or service, then it becomes capital. So all these things can be allocated in different ways. So right now, one of my jobs, I teach this class, and I do research. I have research projects that are going on, but I'm also the chair of the political science department. So as the chair of the political science department, one of the things I do is schedule classes, and I figure out who's going to be teaching what class in what classroom, all this sort of stuff. Is it going to be online delivery, or is it going to be face-to-face delivery? Are we going to offer it in first week, the first 5 weeks of the summer? Are we going to offer it second 5 weeks? Or how are we going to do this stuff? Basically, that's an economic decision, and I use all of these things, right? The natural resources in that I have physical space that I can actually allocate, specifically classroom space, labor, who's going to teach the class, and capital, what sort of equipment is going to be in there, right? Are we going to outfit something with a smart podium? Or are we going to put additional projectors? Is it going to be an IVN class? Have you guys taken a class like that? Right, where it's like projected between the Gulf Coast campus and this campus, right? So those sorts of questions are things that we can ask about any economic decision. So those are the scarce resources that we can use to produce educational resources or educational services. Now, given the fact that we have these limited resources, then we get to this first idea in economics, really, and that's one of opportunity cost. That any time I decide to, let's say, use a classroom for a political science class at 2:25, Tuesday and Thursday in the fall semester, what does that mean that I'm not doing with that classroom?
Using it for anything else?
I'm not using it for anything else. I'm not using it for an economics class. I'm not using it for a paralegal studies class or American studies class. These are all programs that I could decide, put people, put that class in that classroom, but I can't do it all, right? I have to make a choice. And so we have a term to describe what you're giving up when you make such a choice, and that term is an opportunity cost. So the opportunity cost is the next best foregone alternative to any decision. It's basically another way of thinking about what you give up to get something. So the opportunity cost, it's not an out-of-pocket cost. It's not a cost that's associated with, let's say, actually spending money. It's a time cost. It's a decision that you're going to use something for one thing rather than something else. So, for example, you guys are all here. I appreciate your attendance. It makes it a little bit better than recording these videos just to an empty room would kind of suck. So I really appreciate that I have an audience here to participate in this little endeavor we have going on. You made a choice to be here, though, right? What did you give up to come here? But what would you be doing with that time?
Reading a book.
You'd be reading a book?
Some work.
Sleeping? Sleeping is usually the number one for students. Like if they're not in class, they'd rather be sleeping, right? That's the main thing. Reading books, do lots of things. You can be catching up on another class. You wouldn't be sleeping, Amber?
No.
No? Not a big sleeper? All right. Some people don't sleep. I don't sleep when most people sleep, but I do sleep. Just happen to take naps in the afternoon, that sort of thing. So whatever you're giving up to be here is the opportunity cost of your time being in this class. Now, for me, I often think about, you can think about little opportunity costs or you can think about big ones, right? So I'm an economics professor. This is what I've decided to do with my life. if I weren't doing this, I could have chosen different career paths. And at some point, you'll look back in your career and say, well, if I didn't decide to do that, I would have done something else, and what would I have done? For me, what I would have done is I would have moved back to Texas, go to UT, and I went to UT. You guys ever been to Austin? Yeah? Been through there? Ever been on the UT campus? There's this really tall tower on the UT campus. That's my very bad drawing of the tower. And what I would do is I would open up a falafel cart and sell falafel sandwiches, my little chef's hat, for Eddie's Falafel, right? Now, that's what I would do. That's my opportunity cost becoming an econ professor because, one, I like cooking. It's not a bad thing. Two, I really like Middle Eastern food. I used to live in the Middle East. I go back to the Middle East usually 3 or 4 times a year because my research takes me there. And so I used to, at one point in my life, used to eat falafel for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, like 3 meals a day occasionally, right? It was really, really cheap. I could get a falafel sandwich for 60 cents. Now the question is, that most people ask at this point is, no one's going to ask this question? I could do that when I retire. That's definitely true. But a more direct question about this whole example would be what? What is falafel sandwich? Exactly. So a lot of people don't know what falafel sandwiches are. Some people do though. Where can you get falafel around here? No one's going to get falafel around here. There are 2 places right on the border of campus where you can get falafel. No? Not Izzo's. Petra, right? The little hookah place over here. Okay, so Petra has falafel and also Glory Bound. Glory Bound has falafel too. Even though if you eat what they serve at Glory Bound, understand that that's not really falafel. It's more like a hush puppy. So falafel is a deep fried, mashed up chickpea ball, right? That's what it is. It's a deep fried little patty made up of chickpeas. And chickpeas are garbanzo beans, right? So you mash those up, and you add them with some other ingredients, including flour. They put too much flour over at Glory Bound, that's their problem. And you deep fry that. It's not enough chickpeas, it's too much flour. Anyway, and you make it into a sandwich like a gyro, like you put it in a pita with lettuce and some tzatziki sauce and this sort of thing. It's a really nice little sandwich. Anyway, used to live on that like breakfast, lunch, and dinner sometimes. So that's what I'd like to do, open up my falafel shop. Now, when you're making falafel, you use oil, and you have usually you have to have pita bread, for the sandwiches, and you have to have chickpeas, obviously, and you have some spices like, you have some paprika, you have some parsley, things like that. All of those things actually go into another Middle Eastern dish, though, is what? Well, it's ground up chickpeas with olive oil and tahini, which is ground sesame paste. Okay. You guys I know you've seen this, hummus. So hummus is made out of basically this. No? You've never had hummus. So it's right downstairs. So go down to the pod sometime, look in the refrigerator section. They've got hummus all over the place. Right? It's those little sabra things with the pretzels, and it's like a little dip.
I'm going to take that.
Okay, go check it out. Hummus and falafel, right? They go together. And you can think about the trade-off between, if I'm a producer, if I'm deciding to produce falafel, and that's what I'm doing for a living, I can decide either to produce hummus with my ingredients, with my chickpeas, with my olive oil, with my Cuisinart mixer thing that I have, with my, my chef's knife and my garlic and everything else. I can make hummus, or I can make falafel. But how much of those two I produce is going to be an economic decision. So we have a model to help us think about this trade-off between producing 2 different goods. And this is what's known as the production possibilities model. It shows the trade-off between the maximum amount of 2 goods that can be produced available resources. Now, the example that I'm going to be doing here has to do specifically with one producer, Eddie's Falafel Shop, right? Eddie's Falafel Cart. That's what I'm looking at. But this same model can be used to talk about an entire economy. Now, we have to abstract away, because of course an economy can produce all sorts of stuff, not just two goods. But if you think about it, I don't know, anyone pay attention to the news in Mississippi State Capitol today? What did Phil Bryant announce yesterday? Anyone pay attention to this? So there are going to be budget cuts, right? So the revenue projections for the state taxes that are coming into the state that help fund public education, roads, I guess, I don't know what else they don't do any kind of defense, I don't think. But all the state agencies, all those things, all the revenue that comes in to fund that stuff, it's coming in lower than what they projected back in June when they set the budget. So they're going to have to cut the budget and cut some money to different state agencies, probably including Southern Miss, right? We could talk about, well, the trade-off between, let's say, higher education, Southern Miss, Ole Miss, etc., and K through 12 education. Those are two different goods or services, really, that we could talk about and trading off between the two. We could use a production possibilities model to talk about that too, right? We could talk about in terms of national defense versus hiring more teachers at the federal level, right? We could talk about any two goods and the trade-offs between those. This model is very flexible and just focuses on this issue of opportunity costs and trade-offs. Now, like I said, we're going to use this specifically to talk about falafel and hummus. Now, the first way to represent production possibilities isn't with a graph or a curve, but it's just going to be with a table, and we call a table a schedule. I don't know why they don't call it just a table, but it's called a production possibilities schedule. So we can think about the different amounts of hummus, and we'll measure this in pints, right? It's kind of liquidy, and the amount of falafel that can be produced using a certain amount of resources, and this is going to be in terms of sandwiches. And these resources will be, let's say, 5 hours of my time in a day. We'll have 50 pieces of pita bread. We'll have, 15 pounds of chickpeas. Whatever it is for this certain amount of resources. How much of this good could I produce, and how much of this good could I produce at its maximum? And you can think about this in terms of, well, what if I produce nothing but hummus, right? Let's say I'm going to be able to produce 100 pints of hummus if I use all of my resources to produce hummus, and I don't produce any falafel. So I use all my chickpeas and I mash them all up, and I put them in the blender, and I put the tahini in there, and I use the oil for that, and I'm able to produce 100 pints of hummus if I make no falafel sandwiches at all. Likewise, if I decided to do nothing but falafel, I could produce 50 falafel sandwiches if I produce no hummus at all. These are two production possibilities. All hummus and no falafel, and all falafel and no hummus. Those are both possible. I can produce them with my available resources. But, of course, that's not the only thing I can produce. If I produce 80 pints of hummus, I have some resources left over. I have some chickpeas left over. I have some oil left over, other things left over. And I can use what's left over to produce some falafel sandwiches. Likewise, I could produce 60, and then I'd have enough left over to produce 20, and then I could go 40 and 30, and then 20 and 40. And so each one of these is a production possibility. And this is just a list of the different combinations of the goods that I can produce with all my stuff. Now, a table in itself isn't very useful, right? It just kind of gives us some numbers. So what economists often do, what we do in economics, is that we often try to get a visual representation of this in order to be able to make it a little bit more flexible and to be able to show what happens if you change the system. How can we understand this graphically rather than just numerically? Because these are just numbers that are sitting up here. So we do both the production possibilities schedule, which is this table right here, and we can do what's known as a production possibilities curve. So in order to talk about a graph, we have to talk a little bit about graphing terminology. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to put up our two axes. All right? So we have this vertical axis here, which is also known as what? The y-axis, right? So we have our vertical axis, also known as our y-axis. And on here is where we'll put our hummus. So our y-axis will be our hummus axis. And again, we're measuring this in pints. So what we're going to be showing along the y-axis is the number of pints that we're producing, the number of pints of hummus that we're producing. And on the x-axis, or the horizontal axis, is going to be the number of falafel sandwiches that we're producing. That's our unit of sandwiches. All right. So now what we can do is we can just plot those different production possibilities from the table on this graph in order to show the production possibilities curve. So if you remember, if we produce nothing but hummus, then we could produce 100 pints. And over here at this point, we'll label that A. And if we produce nothing but falafel, we can produce 50 sandwiches, and we'll label that point. Going to be E or F. Did I put up 6? How many rows are in that table? I think there's 6 actually, right? There's 6. Okay. I always wanted to say 5, but I know that's always a mistake that you make, right? Because you always have to add one more. So then we'll label that one F, right? And then we know that we have these different units. We can go down 80 to 60 to 40 to 20, all the way down to 0. And likewise, 10, 20, 30, 40. Sometimes I'll bring my yardstick to make this more precise. We're not going to do that right now. It's okay. Close enough. Not super precise. So we remember that 80 and 10 was one combination, and 60 and 20 was one combination, and then 40 and 30, and likewise 20 and 20 hummus pints and 40 falafel sandwiches. And the end result is what we end up getting. Those points are a little bit off there. We end up getting a line. Now, why do we call it a curve if it's a line? It's just what we call it, right? It's just one of those things. Like, we talk about demand curves and then draw straight lines. We talk about supply curves and draw straight lines. Everything's called a curve. It's just the terminology, right? So this is what's known as our production possibilities curve. PPC, or production possibilities curve. Now, what's useful about doing this in a graphical manner is that we can talk about areas within this and think about what's available and what's not available. Remember what this curve is telling us. This is the maximum amount of these two goods that we can produce. So if I show some point out here, like let's say it's 80 pints of hummus and 30 falafel sandwiches, what do we know about that point? It's not possible, right? It's infeasible. We can't produce it with our given technology and our available resources and everything that we have. Now, if we had twice as much chickpeas and we had, more time and everything else, yeah, we might be able to produce that. But given our resources, it's not within what's possible. It's not within the production possibility curve. Likewise, what about a point within here? Is that possible? Is that feasible? Yeah, you could do that, but why would you not want to?
It's inefficient.
It's inefficient. We're not using all of our resources. We could use more resources and produce more of both goods. So a point down here is feasible, but inefficient because we're not producing as much as we possibly could. This might represent, by the way, on the macroeconomy scale, a point of excess unemployment. If you have a lot of labor that's not being used towards productive resources, then guess what? You're not going to be producing what's on your production possibility curve overall. All right. Questions about this? Now, the other thing that we have in here is implicit measure of opportunity cost. Specifically, what you give up as a ratio of what you get. So if I wanted to produce 10 more falafel sandwiches, what is it that I'd have to give up?
Hummus.
I'd have to give hummus, right? So if I went from, let's say, point C to point D, right? I'm going from 20 pints of hummus, sorry, I'm going from 20 falafel sandwiches and 60 pints of hummus to 40 pints of hummus and 30 falafel sandwiches. So what am I getting here?
Getting 10 sandwiches.
I'm getting 10 sandwiches, so that's what I'm getting. What am I giving up?
20.
I'm giving up 20 pints, and so my opportunity cost of getting an additional falafel sandwich is 2, right? So for each individual falafel sandwich I get, I'm giving up 2 pints of hummus. And so what's the opportunity cost of a falafel sandwich? 2 pints of hummus. And that's how we discuss opportunity cost in this context, where you talk about what you're giving up in order to get. Now, if we flip that around and said, oh, well, what if I'm down here at D and I want to produce more pints of hummus? Well, for every pint of hummus I produce, what am I giving up? I'm giving up half of a falafel sandwich because I give up 10 in order to get 20. So each pint of hummus costs me half of a falafel sandwich. That's the opportunity cost of a pint of hummus. You guys get that? Yeah. Okay. We're going to come back to that. That's going to be something that I'm going to ask about in the review questions and such, is to do a little bit of calculation to understand, opportunity cost in this context, right? So to understand how you can use a production possibility schedule or a production possibility curve in order to actually calculate what the opportunity cost is. All right. Questions about this?
Do you always have to give up half?
In this case, you do,
Okay.
because it's linear, right? It doesn't look linear because I drew a pentagram. I should have brought in my, my yardstick and stuff because it doesn't look very linear right now. But production possibility curves don't have to be linear. As a matter of fact, my favorite example of production possibility curve, and the one that I think is actually more similar to reality, is one that's kind of bowed out in shape. And if you read the appendix of chapter 1, they talk about these production possibility curves that are bowed out. And the idea is that if you're producing somewhere kind of in the middle, where you're producing some of this and some of that, then you're actually producing more kind of on average stuff, because not all resources that are good at producing falafel are great at producing hummus. Not all resources that are good at producing hummus are great at producing falafel. And you can think about it in terms of like, there's a macroeconomic example of production possibility curves, and it's called guns versus butter, right? You can either produce defense goods, right, guns, right, tanks, armory, artillery, whatever, or you can produce consumer goods, butter and t-shirts and things that people want to buy. And if you think about how we're trading off as a society, like you can think about like, North Korea, what is their trade-off between guns versus butter? Well, they shift a lot of their resources towards the guns, right? And they don't produce very many consumer goods. Well, in America, we produce a lot of consumer goods and a lot of guns, but we actually are much more leaning towards consumer goods than a lot of societies, right? So you can think about the Canadians or the French, right? Think about the French. They produce good jets, but they don't produce a lot of defense goods compared to the United States. So they lean towards consumer goods. North Korea leans towards defense goods. Are the same resources that are good at producing Boeing fighters, right, or McDonnell Douglas, I forget who produces our fighter jets nowadays, good at producing butter, literally, or M1 Abrams tanks? Can you use the same exact resources to produce a tank as you can to produce butter? No. So you're going to get this point where out here you can produce more of kind of on average both than on the extremes. Because if you're on the extreme and you're using everything to produce, let's say, guns, then you're using like dairy cows to produce M1 Abrams tanks. And it's not very efficient to do so. So you have to give up a lot of butter to produce that last gun. And that's why you get that bowed out shape. And in that case, you'd be changing the opportunity cost as you go along. The opportunity cost from A to B would be different from B to C, et cetera. In this case, it's linear. All right, good question. Garrett?
Is that the same type of model that would work on a macro scale, talking about like in a full economy?
Right, that's the guns versus butter example. It would be the full economy, would be one way of thinking about the full economy model. Yeah. Okay. All right, other questions? All right, let's jump into our final model for today, and that'll be this supply and demand. And again, this is going to be our workhorse throughout the semester. We're going to see a lot of different contexts. Now the first thing that I'm going to start off with, so this is model 2, supply and demand. I'm going to start off with the demand schedule. And just like the production possibility schedule, it's just going to be a table which describes different combinations. But this, instead of talking about two different goods, what we're talking about is the price of a good, specifically the price of a falafel sandwich, and the quantity demanded of that sandwich. I want to make sure I use my my numbers correctly. All right. So let's say that the price is $2, and the question is, how many sandwiches could I sell as, you know, Eddie's falafel cart at a price of $2? Now, market research can tell you this. Usually people understand it a little bit more from just practice, like they try a price and then they figure out, well, how much did I sell that day? They try a different price, or they look at someone else that's doing something similar, right? You'd see, like if you wanted to open up your own kind of like burrito shop, you'd go to Izzo's and see like on an average day they're selling, you know, at this price, they're selling about this many. You get an idea of that. But the idea of the demand curve is that it exists somewhere even if you don't actually observe these prices. But let's say just theoretically, at a price of 2, I could sell 45. At a price of 4, I could sell 35. Price of 6, 25, 8, 15. And if I raise my price to 10, I'd only sell 5 sandwiches in a given day. Right. Now, even if you don't necessarily agree with these numbers in this relationship, does this, I mean, the numbers in terms of the precise relationship, does the general relationship make sense? And how would you describe that, Garrett?
The more you raise the price, the less people are willing to pay for the good or service.
Right, so the more you raise the price, the higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded, right? So the higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded. And that's what is known as the law of demand. That everything else held equal, as the price gets higher, the quantity demanded of the good is going to get lower. That's the law of demand. Another way of saying this is that there is an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. Now, again, some specific terminology that I think is useful to keep in mind. I'll let you guys finish writing that real quick. Is that we will refer to this as the relationship between price and quantity demanded, and not the price and demand. Demand refers to this entire relationship. So this describes demand overall. What is demand like? Well, this describes demand. Quantity demanded is how much people want at a particular price. And we'll show that graphically in the distinction between the two in just a second. But something to keep in mind in terms of your usage of those two terms. Quantity demanded refers to how much consumers want at a particular price. Okay, so we did this in a schedule, and just like before, we can now convert that into a graph. That was a really nice graph. And this graph is just going to be called our demand curve. On the y-axis, we'll put prices. This will be dollars per sandwich. And on the x-axis, we'll put quantity. And that's just the number of sandwiches. So we have price on the y, quantity on the x. And so at each of the hash marks, I've labeled these as $2 increments, and then I've gone ahead and done 5 sandwich units, right? So it goes 5, 10, 15, 20 for each one of those, just to kind of get your bearings in between them. So 5, 10, 15, 20, etc. So if you remember, at $10, I could only sell 5. At 8, the quantity demanded would be 15. At 6, it was 25. At 4, 35. And at $2, it was 45. We can connect all these because just because I gave the specific prices doesn't mean that there aren't also prices in between. And that we'll label with a D to show that's our demand curve. All right, so this is our demand curve. And again, it's linear, just the way that I've constructed it based upon the demand schedule that I wrote a second ago. And we can think about this as being a representation of demand. If we talk about quantity demanded, we're talking about a point on the demand curve. The entire curve is the demand curve. So when you say, what's happening with demand, you're talking about this entire relationship. And generally the question is it staying the same? Is it shifting to the right? Is it shifting to the left? There are things that might change this relationship. This just happens to be the one at any point in time. So for example, let's say that there's a new movie that comes out, right? And one of the Helmsworth brothers is, being all bulky and, long blonde hairy and such. And he's eating falafel sandwiches in the middle of the movie, right? For like a 5-minute scene. It's just, one of the Helmsworths, Chris Helmsworth, whatever the Helmsworth guys are, the Thor guy, right? Is sitting there eating falafel sandwiches. What's going to happen to the demand curve for falafel? It's going to increase. It's going to shift to the right? So consumer taste changing would shift the demand curve, and that entire relationship between price and quantity demanded is going to change. And that would be a change in the demand. Likewise, if there's what's happened with Chipotle in the last couple months?
They got a lot of legal action.
This is some legal action because what's happened? Yeah, the E. coli breakout, right? All of a sudden, there's an E. coli breakout at the largest falafel chain in the country, which would be there's one down in New Orleans. I wish I could remember that. Anyway, there is actually like a national falafel chain. Anyway, let's say that a similar thing happened, but to the national falafel chain, and all of a sudden, what's going to happen to demand? Shift it to the left, right? Other things can shift demand. We'll talk a little bit more about those on Tuesday, but this is the basic idea, that demand is a relationship, and this particular demand curve is controlling for everything else. It's saying if nothing else changes, for example, people's income, the prices of other goods doesn't change, consumer tastes and preferences don't change, if the, let's see, what else? Oh, expected future prices change. What's going on with oil prices right now? They're dropping pretty significantly, right? As oil prices are dropping, what do you expect to happen to gas prices? You expect gas prices a week from today probably to be higher or lower than today? Lower. I mean, I was paying like $1.65 last week. What are they today?
$1.50.
$1.55, right? And so if you think that this is what's happening with oil prices, what's going to happen to what you're going to pay for gas today? How much are you willing to fill up your tank today compared to next week if you think oil prices are going to continue to fall?
We're gonna fill more next week.
We're going to fill up more next week, and we're going to wait until those prices fall. So expectations of future prices change too. Now I got to go because I'm almost out of gas, and I figure $1.55 who cares? I mean, it's pretty cheap. So, but the idea is like lots of things can change this relationship, but at any point in time, this is the relationship that we're talking about, and that's demand. All right, questions about that? All right, let's get supply in here, and then we'll put the two together. Then we can put together a supply schedule, just like we have a demand schedule, where you have price and quantity supplied. And in this case now, we have what kind of relationship between price and quantity supplied?
It's direct.
It's a direct relationship or a positive relationship. As one increases, the other one increases as well, right? So for demand, it was an inverse relationship or an indirect relationship. And for supply, it's a direct relationship or a positive relationship. Now, what's the story about why this happens? This isn't as necessarily intuitive for you, partially because you've spent most of your lives as consumers, but not as much as producers, right? You know, maybe if you've been working for a while, you think about the value of your time in this context, right? If you think about, well, if someone wanted to pay me, you know, let's say these are hours per week, like how much would you be willing to work at only $2, you know, $2 per hour? That'd probably be pretty little, just because you've got a lot of better things to do with your time. As you're asking more and more of your time, are you going to be willing to work 40 hours a week for $2 an hour? No, you spend that time studying, spend that time hanging out with friends. It's not worth your time. What about for, you know, $10 an hour? You know, for a lot of people in college, they'd be willing to work 40 hours a week for $10 an hour, right? You know, maybe it'd be tough if you're taking 12 or 15 hours, but for $10 an hour, people are usually willing to spend the time. So if you think about it in that context, the whole idea is, again, about opportunity cost. Now, here we're not talking about time, we're talking about falafel sandwiches. You know, there is a difference. But what is it that I'm giving up as a producer when I'm deciding to supply more falafel sandwiches? What am I not producing?
Hummus.
I'm not producing hummus, right? So given how much I can get for selling hummus and how much effort it takes to make hummus versus falafel, at a really low price for falafel, I'd rather be making hummus, while at a really high price for falafel, I'd rather be making falafel and making less hummus. And so the same sort of idea comes back to it, which is opportunity costs are increasing, and therefore, the only way you can induce someone to supply more of a good is to raise the price. So their willingness to supply increases as the price increases. So we get this direct relationship between price and quantity supply. Does everyone see that? All right, okay. So let's go ahead and do this in a graph now, and we'll put the two together. Again, you're going to have price on the y-axis, and this is in terms of dollars per sandwich. We're going to have quantity on the x, quantity on the x, with the number of sandwiches. Price and quantity. Seems like I'm only going to use part of this graph, but that's okay. And I'm just going to go ahead and draw the supply curve like that without plotting out the points. You guys get the relationship, how we're going to plot that, right? So ultimately out here, I'm going to get 45 at $10, and each one of these other points reflects what I did before, right? At $4, I can sell, I'm willing to sell 15. At $6, I'm willing to sell 25. At $8, I'm willing to sell 35, right? So I'm just going to plot those points. That was way over there. That's really bad. Okay. All right. So now I have supply, and it's upward sloping. Again, that direct relationship. We have it upward sloping. Additionally, we can refer to the quantity supplied versus the supply. At any given price, we know what the quantity supplied is. That's the point on the supply curve, while supply is the entire relationship. And just like things can shift the demand curve, different changes can shift the supply curve. So, for example, what if there was a chickpea blight that wiped out a third of the crop of chickpeas in the entire world? That's going to affect supply. It's probably going to shift it which way? It's going to shift it to the left. And it's tricky because you want to say demand decreases, or supply decreases. But the tricky thing with saying that is that if you say down, which way are you thinking? You're thinking this way, which is actually increasing supply, right? So when thinking about supply and demand, try to think about the quantity and not the price axis. So think about shifting left and right as increasing, left and right as decreasing and increasing rather than up and down, right? So think about it in terms of quantity. So increasing supply means more quantity shift to the right. Less supply means lower quantity shift to the left. Sorry, you had a question? That was the question exactly. Okay. Right. And as a matter of fact, one of my first econ classes, I got a question wrong on a test because I think the test was written wrong because the guy said something about a decrease in supply and he was talking about it being lower vertically rather than horizontally. And I argued with the guy. He's a grad student. He was wrong. So, because it can be confusing if you say decrease in supply and you're saying, well, I'm down here, I'm lower, but no, you got to think about it in terms of quantity, right? Think about what's going on with the horizontal axis. All right. So now we have supply. We can put demand in here as well. And we remember from before, looks something like that. And it just so happens that at the price of 6, we get 25 as being both our quantity supplied and our quantity demanded. So at price equal to 6, quantity demanded is equal to 25. Quantity supplied is equal to 25. And that means in this market model, we have what's known as an equilibrium. An equilibrium is simply the price at which quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. Now, remember what we were talking about before, which was, what is economics? It is the science that deals with the allocation of scarce resources to satisfy unlimited wants. We used one model that showed what kind of trade-offs have to be made when producing a good, but then we never said actually, well, how much is produced in society? We said, okay, we know that we can produce this much hummus and this much falafel, or this other combination of hummus and falafel, but we never said, well, how much is actually produced then? How much is produced in this market? Well, to get to that, we need both what consumers want or willing to pay, which is the demand curve, in addition to what suppliers are willing to do, which is the supply curve. The interaction of those two determine price and quantity in the market. Now we're going to do a whole lot of this for the next few weeks. We're going to do lots of different examples, have different kinds of markets that we're going to talk about. We're talking about shortages and surpluses and all sorts of stuff, but I really just want to get to the very basics today. Any questions about this? Right. There's a lot of terminology in Chapter 1. Some of it can be confusing. If you have questions about that stuff, make sure to bring those questions on Tuesday. I also have posted a discussion board. You can feel free to go online, post your questions there, and I can answer those in class when we come back on Tuesday too. All right, question? So next week what I'm going to do is I'm going to post some review questions that will be due on Monday. And that'll be, again, online, just so everybody can answer them. And then on Thursday is when that paper is going to be due. And again, that paper is just going to be go out, find an article that deals something with economics. You can talk about opportunity costs, trade-offs, markets, whatever it is, and describe how it relates to the material in Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. Yeah, Gary.
Can we talk about the oil surplus that's going on right
You can talk about the oil surplus that's going on right now. That's a perfectly fine article.
Bring in a copy of the thing.
You're just going to include a link on when you submit it online. So just as you submit it online, make sure to just do an online link. Yep. Any questions about that? I'm going to try to post the questions by tomorrow afternoon, at the latest Saturday morning, and then they'll be due 48 hours later. Okay? I'm still working on the technology, so I can't say definitely, like I can't go back right now and guarantee that I can do it in 15 minutes. If I could, I would. I'll try to get it up as soon as I can. All right. So I'll send out an announcement. I'll send out both an email announcement and put it on the announcements page on the Blackboard site too. All right. Have a good weekend, guys.